I turned the page of the 18th album on a Tuesday evening in late October, and the face I had been seeing every Wednesday morning for 19 years was standing in the back of a photograph my wife had taken 30 years ago. My name is Edmund Carstairs. I am 73 years old. I am, since the spring before last, a widower. My wife was Lenora Carstairs, who founded the Hartfield Veterans Provident Fund in the second year of our marriage and ran it for 48 years without once allowing her name on its letterhead. When she died, she left me 61 leather-bound albums of photographs she had taken across half a century of charitable work, indexed in her own hand on the inside front cover of each volume, and a note in her bureau drawer that said, in the careful copperplate she used for the things that mattered, "Edmund, look at all of them, not at once, one by one, slowly. There are things in them I never thought to tell you." I had been working through the albums at a rate of one a week since the funeral. The 18th album was the autumn of the year our daughter was born, which would make it 30 years and 4 months ago, and the page I turned to that Tuesday evening in my study, with the lamp on and the rain beginning at the window and a cup of tea cooling at my elbow, was the page that held the photograph of the Hartfield Review Stand collapse. You will not have heard it called that. It was not in the end called anything official. A reviewing stand at a ceremonial parade for a regimental anniversary had given way along its left rail at the 23rd minute of the ceremony, and a senior officer of the regiment, Colonel Aldous Vance, who was on the stand to deliver the regimental honors, had been thrown forward against the brass railing and had taken the broken end of a rail into the muscle of his right shoulder. The photograph that went into every newspaper the next morning was the photograph my wife had taken from the press apron 8 feet below the stand. Colonel Vance held upright at the moment of the collapse, his uniform tunic dark along the shoulder, his face composed against the pane, and behind him, half turned, a young soldier in the dress whites of the secondary security detail with one white-gloved hand under the colonel's elbow and the other braced flat against the small of the colonel's back. Colonel Vance is the center of the photograph. The young soldier is in the soft focus behind him, 3 feet to the colonel's right, eyes forward, jaw set, hand steady. The photograph was published the next morning above a caption naming Colonel Vance. The young soldier was not named. He was not interviewed. The official regimental report listed by name the 4 senior officers who attended Colonel Vance in the first minute after the collapse, and the 4 were promoted in due course, and the colonel himself recovered and went on to a long and decorated career, and is, at the time of this writing, the regiment's most senior living veteran. The young soldier in the back of the photograph, with his white-gloved hand under the colonel's elbow, was never identified in any account. He was a face in the secondary detail. He went back to his post. I had seen that photograph 100 times. It hung framed in the entrance hall of the Veterans Provident Fund's offices, where Lenora had hung it the year the fund was founded, because the fund's founding endowment had been raised in the wave of public feeling that followed the collapse. I had walked past it twice a week for 30 years. I had never, in all that walking past, looked closely at the young soldier in the soft focus behind the colonel. On that Tuesday evening in October, I did. I looked at his face for perhaps 40 seconds. I took my reading glasses off and held them an inch from the photograph. I lifted the album to the lamp. I sat very still in my chair for a long minute with the album open on my lap and the rain at the window, and I understood that the face of the young soldier in the back of the photograph was the face of the Royal Guardsman who stood at the east gate of the House of Hartfield on the second Wednesday of every month, when I drove down with the month's delivery of supplies for the Veterans Provident Fund and was waved through by the man at the gate. I had known that face for 19 years. I had nodded to it every second Wednesday of every month for 228 Wednesday mornings. I had never asked the man his name. I sat back from the album. I had recognized a face, that was all. I had recognized a face, and in the recognizing I had taken a man who had been, for 30 years, an anonymous figure in the soft focus of a famous photograph, and I had moved him 3 feet to the right in the frame and into the place where he had always been standing. He had been there all along. He had been there at the East Gate every Wednesday for 19 years that I had known of, and for 19 more before that. The only thing that had changed was that one person had finally looked. I sat with the album open until the tea at my elbow had gone cold. Then I marked the page with a slip of paper, closed the album, and went to my desk, and I wrote a letter. I wrote the letter to the Lord Chamberlain's office of the House of Hartfield, by name to the Chamberlain himself, on the heavy cream stock my wife had used for the fund's correspondence. I wrote that I was Edmund Carstairs of the Hartfield Veterans Provident Fund, that I was the widower of Lenora Carstairs who founded the fund, that I was working through my late wife's photographic archive, and that I believed I had identified, in a photograph of a public event of 30 years ago, a man currently serving in the household's ceremonial battalion. I gave the date of the photograph. I described the young soldier's position in the frame. I described, without naming him, the Royal Guardsman at the East Gate. I asked in the closing paragraph whether the household's regimental archivist might be willing to verify the identification against the rolls of the secondary security detail of that date. I enclosed a clean copy of the photograph. I sealed the envelope. I posted it on the Wednesday morning on my way to the East Gate with the month's supplies. I drove through the gate at 10:30. The Royal Guardsman at the post was the man I have been describing. I nodded to him. He gave the slight courtesy nod that the household's guards are permitted to give to recurring delivery vehicles. I drove through. I did not say good morning. I had not in 19 years said good morning. To break it now, before the letter had been read, would be to put a private greeting onto a public matter. I unloaded the supplies. I drove home. I waited. The reply came 8 days later on a Thursday in an envelope marked with the Lord Chamberlain's seal. It was from the household's regimental archivist, a woman named Mariel Stannerlight, whom I had not previously met. She wrote in 3 careful paragraphs that she had received my letter and the enclosed photograph, that she had cross-referenced the photograph against the rolls of the secondary security detail of the date in question, and that she had identified the young soldier in the background of the photograph as Guardsman Henry Carrick, then aged 23, who had been assigned to the secondary security detail of the regimental anniversary ceremony as part of his first year of post-duty. Guardsman Carrick was, at the time of her writing, 61 minutes past completing his 12:30 rotation at the East Gate of the House of Hartfield. He had served in the ceremonial battalion of the household for 38 years. He had never, in those 38 years, submitted a single account, application, or correspondence of any kind referring to his presence at the regimental anniversary ceremony of 30 years ago, or to any act performed at that ceremony. Miss Stannerlight closed her letter by writing that she was, with the household's permission, prepared to support a formal acknowledgement of Guardsman Carrick's act of that day, that the official record of the ceremony was within the scope of household archival amendment, and that she would await my further correspondence. I read the letter 3 times. I set it on my desk. I sat for a while with my hands folded on the blotter, looking at nothing. Then I drafted the op-ed. I am not by training a man of letters. I made my living in heavy iron, in things you can weigh. But my wife's name carried in the charitable press a weight that mine never had, and the editor of the broadsheet that had carried the original story of the collapse was an old correspondent of Lenora's, and I knew I could place an op-ed there if I signed it as the trustee of the Hartfield Veterans Provident Fund. I worked on the draft for 4 evenings. I did not allow myself to make it sentimental. I wrote in 800 plain words the history of the photograph, the identity of the young soldier in the back of the frame, the steadying hand under the colonel's elbow, the 30 years of public silence, the daily duty of the man at the East Gate, and the modest sentence with which I closed the piece. That an act of quiet competence performed at 23 years of age, in the back of a frame, in support of a wounded man, is no less an act of honor for not having been named at the time, and that the honor it carries is the honor of the man and not the honor of the record, but that the record may, in due course, be amended. I sent the draft to the editor on a Friday afternoon. He printed it on the Sunday, on page 9, above my name as trustee of the Hartfield Veterans Provident Fund, with my wife's name in the 3rd paragraph. I read it in the kitchen at 7 that Sunday morning. The piece named the act, not the man's feelings about it. I folded the paper. I waited. On Monday morning, the household's Office of Public Correspondence rang my study at 20 minutes past 9 and asked, very courteously, whether I would be willing to receive a call later that day from the Lord Chamberlain's office. I said I would. The call came at 4. The Chamberlain himself spoke briefly, then put me through to Miss Stannerlight, who confirmed that the household had reviewed the op-ed and the underlying archival evidence, that the household intended to issue, by the Wednesday afternoon, a formal acknowledgement of Guardsman Carrick's act at the regimental anniversary ceremony of 30 years ago, that the historic photograph would be officially recaptioned in the National Archive to include his name, and that the regimental celebration day at the close of the month would include a brief ceremony at which a household medal, the honor of the steady hand, would be presented to Guardsman Carrick in the inner court of the House of Hartfield. I asked whether Guardsman Carrick had been consulted. Miss Stannerlight said that he had. I asked whether he had accepted. There was a pause on the line. Miss Stannerlight said he accepted. He asked only that the ceremony be brief. I sat for a long moment after I put the receiver down. I had set out to put a line back into a record, but a line in a record carries behind it a man, and the man had been asked, and the man had agreed, and the man had requested only that the asking of him be brief. I wrote in my own ledger in pencil the single word brief. The ceremony was held on the 28th of October, at 3 in the afternoon, in the inner court of the House of Hartfield. The inner court is a square of pale stone with a single ornamental tree at its center and a low colonnade on 3 sides. The household had assembled in the open square, perhaps 60 persons. The Lord Chamberlain, the household archivist, the senior officers of the ceremonial battalion, 3 members of Colonel Vance's family, Colonel Vance himself, who is now 91 years old and was seated in a chair with a blanket across his knees, and a small number of trustees of the Veterans' Provident Fund, of whom I was one. Guardsman Henry Carrick stood at attention at the foot of the colonnade. He was in full ceremonial dress. He was 61 years old. The bearskin made him a head taller than he was. The face under the bearskin was the face I had recognized in the album. The white gloves were the gloves I had seen at the East Gate. He stood with his rifle in formal post arms and his chin level and his eyes forward, as I had seen him stand for 19 years. A standard of the regiment was carried in at the cadence of the dress drill, and the court fell silent. The chaplain offered an invocation. The chamberlain read the citation, naming Carrick and thanking Mrs. Carstairs for the photograph. The medal, small bronze on a deep blue ribbon, was presented by Colonel Vance, helped to his feet by his son, who held it in both hands and looked into Carrick's face 3 full seconds before giving it over. Carrick stood with hands at his sides in the neutral set of a man who has held them for 38 years. The court was quiet enough to hear a sparrow in the tree. The colonel looked at the man who had put a young hand under his elbow when he was 61 and bleeding, and the man who had been 23 looked back, and between them passed a recognition that needed no medal. The recognition had already happened. Guardsman Carrick accepted the box. He inclined his head to the colonel by precisely the angle the drill manual permits. He inclined his head to the Lord Chamberlain by the same angle. He turned his head to the assembled persons in the inner court, and he said one sentence in a quiet voice, in the clear, precise speech of a man who has stood a public post for 38 years and does not waste a syllable. He said, "I held a fellow soldier upright. Any of us would have done it." Then he turned and walked across the inner court in the slow, measured step of the dress drill, and went back through the small door under the colonnade to the corridor that leads to the East Gate, where his afternoon rotation would commence at 4. I stood in the inner court for some minutes after he had gone. Colonel Vance was helped to his chair. The household party moved off toward the colonnade for a brief reception. Miss Stannerlight came over to me and shook my hand and said, "Thank you, Mr. Carstairs." I said, "Thank you, Miss Stannerlight." Neither of us said anything else. I went home that evening to the empty house, and I made a cup of tea, and I sat in my study with the 18th album closed on the desk in front of me, and I thought about my wife who had taken the photograph, and who had known, in some quiet way I will never now ask her about, that the young soldier in the back of the frame was a man worth knowing. She had hung the photograph in the entrance hall of the fund's offices. She had walked past it for 30 years. She had not, so far as I am aware, ever spoken his name aloud, but she had known, she must have known, and she had left me 61 albums and a note in her bureau drawer that said, "Edmund, look at all of them, not at once, one by one, slowly. There are things in them I never thought to tell you." I had been married to Lenora for 49 years, and in those 49 years I had asked her 10,000 questions, and I had not asked her the one that would have produced in answer the name of Henry Carrick. The not asking had been mine, the knowing had been hers. The 61 albums were her way of saying, after she was gone, the things she had decided in life not to press upon me. I do not yet know what is in the other 43. On the 2nd Wednesday of November, I drove down to the East Gate of the House of Hartfield with the month's supplies for the Veterans' Provident Fund. I drove through the gate at 10:30. Guardsman Henry Carrick was on the post. I rolled the window down. I am a man of 73, and the rolling down of a window in late autumn is no small ceremony for me. I rolled it down. I leaned a little out. I said, "Good morning, Guardsman Carrick." He did not turn his eyes. The drill does not permit it. But the small, slight courtesy nod that the household's guards are permitted to give to a recurring vehicle came at the precise angle of the dress drill, and he said, in the quiet voice of a man at his post, "Good morning, Mr. Carstairs." I drove through. I've driven through that gate on the second Wednesday of every month since, and we have each time exchanged the morning by name, and the cobblestones of the east gate of the House of Hartfield have continued to be cobblestones, and the medal sits, as I am told, in the box on Guardsman Carrick's small dresser in the barracks of the ceremonial battalion, and the historic photograph in the National Archive bears now, beneath the name of Colonel Aldous Vance, the words and Guardsman Henry Carrick. Age 23, secondary security detail, whose steadying hand is visible at the colonel's elbow. It is not a great change to the historic record, it is one line beneath another. But it is the line that was missing for 30 years, and it is there now, and the man who put his hand under the colonel's elbow on the 23rd minute of a ceremony 30 years ago is named in the place where he was always standing. And on the second Wednesday of every month when I drive down with the supplies, I say good morning to him by name, and he says good morning to me, and the cobblestone of the east gate goes on being cobblestone. And the small honor that was overdue for 30 years sits now in its proper place, and that, in the quiet way that the truest things are quiet, is enough.